What if everything you've been told about power is incomplete? Because history seems to follow a simple rule. The strongest empires control the richest lands. The most valuable cities sit on rivers, trade routes, or natural resources. Power in its simplest form is supposed to be logical, but there is one place that completely breaks that rule. A city with no great river, no vast farmland, no economic advantage strong enough to justify obsession. And yet for thousands of years, rulers, armies, and entire civilizations treated it as if it were the center of the world. That city is Jerusalem. And here is the contradiction that most people never fully process. Jerusalem should not matter this much. By every measurable standard, it should have been just another forgotten settlement in the ancient world. No fertile plains like Mesopotamia, no life-giving artery like the Nile River, no strategic trade dominance like Constantinople. It does not naturally produce wealth, it does not dominate geography, and it does not offer the kind of advantage that empires usually fight over. And yet, empires didn't just want it. They needed it. Most people think this is a story about land or politics, but that assumption misses the deeper mechanism entirely. Smart observers understand that Jerusalem reveals something far more powerful than territory. It exposes how belief can outweigh logic, how meaning can override strategy, and how identity can become more valuable than any resource on earth. To understand why Jerusalem became worth more than empires, you have to go back to a time before it was sacred, before it was symbolic, before it was even important. You have to go back to when it was almost nothing. In its earliest form, Jerusalem was a small and unremarkable settlement in the hills of Canaan. It did not command attention. It did not dominate its surroundings. It existed quietly, surrounded by larger and more influential powers. If you were mapping the ancient world, this is not the place you would focus on. It was easy to overlook, easy to ignore, and easy to dismiss. But it had one subtle advantage that would slowly shape its destiny. It sat between regions that mattered, between Africa and Asia, between emerging empires, between pathways that people moved along. It was not a destination, it was a crossing point. And that is where the pattern begins. Because history does not always start with dominance. Sometimes it starts with positioning. A place that connects worlds can eventually become more important than the worlds themselves. Then came a decision that changed everything. Around 1000 BCE, a king named David captured Jerusalem. At first glance, this looks like a routine military move, but it was far more strategic than it appears. David did not choose Jerusalem because it was powerful. He chose it because it wasn't. The city did not belong to any single tribe of Israel, which meant it could function as neutral ground. It was not tied to existing rivalries. It could unify instead of divide. That made it perfect. But this is where most people underestimate what happened next. David didn't just take control of a city, he redefined its role. He made it his capital, and in doing so he shifted its identity from a local settlement into a central symbol of a unified kingdom. And then came the next transformation. David's son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. This was not just a religious structure, it was a psychological turning point. Because once the temple existed, Jerusalem was no longer just a political center, it became a spiritual one. This is where the rules begin to change. Because when a place becomes sacred, it stops being replaceable. You can rebuild a capital somewhere else, you can shift trade routes, move populations, and redraw borders. But once a place is tied to belief, it becomes fixed in a way that geography alone cannot explain. This is the moment Jerusalem becomes dangerous. Because now, losing the city is no longer just a political loss, it becomes an existential one. And that is exactly what happened. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, the temple was torn down, and the population was exiled. From a traditional perspective, this should have ended Jerusalem's importance. Cities fall all the time. Empires erase them, rebuild them, or replace them entirely. But Jerusalem did something different. It became more powerful after it was destroyed. This is the part most people miss, and it changes how you understand everything that follows. When the people of Jerusalem lost their city, they didn't lose its meaning. Instead, they carried it with them. They wrote about it, they prayed toward it, they imagined it, and in doing so they transformed it into something that no army could fully destroy. Jerusalem moved from the physical world into the psychological one. And once something exists in the minds of people, it becomes almost impossible to eliminate. You can burn buildings, but you cannot erase belief. You can conquer land, but you cannot fully control identity. This is the mechanism that made Jerusalem unstoppable. When Cyrus the Great later allowed the exiled population to return and rebuild, Jerusalem rose again, but it was no longer just a city being reconstructed. It was an idea being reinforced. Its destruction had not weakened it, it had strengthened it. And then something even more significant happened. Jerusalem's meaning expanded beyond a single group. With the rise of Christianity, the city became central to the life and death of Jesus Christ. Now Jerusalem was not just sacred to one people, it became sacred to millions across different regions and cultures. Its importance multiplied, and then it expanded again. In Islam, Jerusalem became associated with the night journey of Muhammad, adding another layer of meaning to the same physical location. Now consider what this creates. Three major belief systems, each with millions, eventually billions, of followers, all connected to one city. This is no longer a local or even regional significance. This is global. This is where the value of Jerusalem becomes almost impossible to measure. Because at this point, it is not just a place, it is a convergence point of identities, and this is where conflict becomes inevitable. Empires could control land, but controlling Jerusalem meant engaging with something far more complex. It meant confronting belief systems that did not disappear when defeated. It meant managing a city that people would not easily give up, not because of what it produced, but because of what it represented. This tension reached one of its most intense expressions during the Crusades. In 1099, Crusaders from Europe captured Jerusalem. What followed was not just a military victory, it was an eruption of belief-driven violence. The city witnessed massacres on a scale that reflected not strategy, but conviction. People were not just fighting for control, they believed they were fighting for something sacred, something absolute, and that belief removed limits. But the story does not end there, because Jerusalem never stays in one state for long. In 1187, a leader named Saladin recaptured the city. Unlike the brutality that came before, his approach introduced a different dynamic. He allowed many civilians to leave safely and restored a sense of order. This shift demonstrated something important. Control of Jerusalem was not just about force, it was about legitimacy, because when a place is sacred, how you control it matters just as much as whether you control it at all. Over the centuries, Jerusalem passed through different hands, including the Ottoman Empire, which maintained relative stability for a long period. On the surface, it seemed like the cycles of extreme conflict had slowed, but beneath the surface, something new was forming. The modern world was beginning to take shape, and with it came a new kind of force, national identity. Unlike empires, which were often built on expansion and control, modern identities were tied to people, culture, and history. And once again, Jerusalem found itself at the center. After World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, control of the region shifted to the British. But instead of resolving tensions, this transition introduced new ones. Different groups, each with historical and religious connections to the land, began to assert their claims more strongly. This is where the story becomes even more complex. Because now Jerusalem was not just sacred, it was politically contested in a modern sense. The creation of Israel in 1948 intensified this dynamic. Wars followed, borders shifted, and the city itself was divided and later brought under Israeli control after the Six-Day War. But despite all these changes, one thing remained constant. The question was never fully resolved, and that is because the question itself is not purely political. It is not just about governance or borders, it is about meaning, and meaning does not have a simple answer. Most people try to understand Jerusalem through the lens of strategy, economics, or military history, but that approach will always fall short. Because Jerusalem operates on a different set of rules. It operates on belief, and belief is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. People will negotiate land. They will compromise on resources. They will adapt to changing political systems. But when something becomes part of identity, compromise becomes much harder. This is why Jerusalem has outlasted every empire that tried to control it. The Roman Empire fell, the Ottomans fell, the Crusader states disappeared. Even modern powers continue to struggle with the same underlying tension. Jerusalem remains, not because it is the strongest city, but because it is one of the most meaningful. And this leads to a realization that goes beyond history. Jerusalem shows that the most valuable things in the world are not always tangible. They are not always measurable. They do not always follow logic. Sometimes, the things that shape history the most are the ones that exist in the minds of people, meaning belief, identity. These are the forces that drive decisions, that motivate sacrifice, that sustain conflict across generations. And once something reaches that level of importance, it becomes incredibly difficult to resolve, because you are no longer dealing with land. You are dealing with what that land represents. That is why Jerusalem has been fought over for thousands of years. Not because of what it has, but because of what it means. And that meaning continues to evolve, continues to expand, and continues to influence the world in ways that are still unfolding. This is not just a story about the past. It is a pattern that continues into the present. Because as long as people attach identity to place, as long as belief shapes perception, and as long as meaning outweighs logic, cities like Jerusalem will continue to matter in ways that defy explanation. And that brings us back to the original contradiction. Jerusalem should not be this important. But it is, not because of geography, not because of resources, but because of something far more powerful, the ideas people refuse to let go of. And as long as those ideas exist, Jerusalem will remain exactly what it has always been, not just a city, but a symbol powerful enough to outlive empires, outlast conflict, and continue shaping history long after the forces that tried to control it have disappeared.